An essential step in pattern work is walking the seam lines. The point of walking seam lines is to ensure that two edges that are going to be sewn together are the same length. This makes the construction easier and more accurate. If you've drafted the pattern from scratch, or if you've just made adjustments to a pattern that you've got, it's important to walk the seam lines. It's even worth checking the seam lines on a commercial pattern, especially if they're long or complex. Let's start with just a basic seam line. I'll use the side seam on this pair of pants. First, you need to draw the seam lines if they're not already printed there, and they probably won't be if you've used a multi-size pattern. Start by measuring in from the cutting line the width of the seam allowance, which will be 5/8 of an inch in this case, and make little dashes with a colored pencil. Then use a fashion curve to connect them in a smooth line. You need a surface that's very pinnable, like a foam core board or a cutting mat. And if you choose a white one, then you can see everything much better through the patterns. Now I'll layer my two pattern pieces together. For a vertical seam like this side seam on the pants, you usually go from the bottom to the top. Start by arranging the pieces with the bottom edges and the side seam lines aligned for a segment of a few inches. Use a little sharp pencil and stick it into the seam lines to hold them together. Then pivot the top pattern piece so that the seam line keeps on matching with the bottom seam line, and move the pencil up a few inches to the next segment and place it there to hold it in position. When you get to the hip curve or some other sections, you might find that the lines diverge a little bit, and your segments are going to have to be short, whatever it takes to make sure that they're always aligned together. When you get to the top of the pattern, pin the two patterns together. This is where you're going to see if the seam lines are the same length or not. If one of the seams is longer than the other one, you're going to have to make a correction. If the difference is 1/4 of an inch or less, you can just shorten the longer pattern so that it matches the shorter one. If the difference is 1/4 of an inch or more, you're going to split the difference. Lengthen the shorter seam by half the difference, and shorten the longer one by half the difference, and then they'll match. Some patterns have intentional ease, so the seam lines are going to be different lengths on purpose. Princess seams usually have a little bit of extra ease in the side front panel to provide some bust shaping. Sleeve caps also usually have some ease, so a sleeves seam line is going to be longer than the armhole that it needs to be set into. To walk a seam that has ease, let's work in 2 steps. First, I'll start out by overlapping the front and back bodice, and I'll pin them together at the shoulder seam. Then, lay the sleeve on top of it as though you're going to sew it. Start walking the seam from one end, pivoting the sleeve pattern as you go. You're going to have to adjust it fairly often because they're opposite curves. When you reach the bodice's shoulder seam, make a little mark on the sleeve seam line. After you make the little mark, move the sleeve pattern down and start walking from the opposite end, and repeat this whole process. When you reach the notches, if they don't match, that's an easy fix. Just redraw the notch on the sleeve seam line to match the one on the armhole. And when you get to the shoulder seam from the bodice, make a mark on the sleeve seam line. The space between those 2 marks that you made on the sleeve cap represents the ease on the sleeve. If you're sewing a seam that has a dart intersecting it, place the darted part of the pattern, which is usually the bodice front, on the bottom, and place the bodice back on top. And begin walking from the bottom of the seam. Walk the seam until you reach the first dart leg, and then make a mark on the top pattern seam line. Now just shift the top pattern up and align that mark with the top leg of the dart, and keep on walking until you reach the top of the seam. That's all there is to it. It's surprising how often you'll find that seam lines don't match. If you want your sewing to be easy and accurate, take the time to walk and correct your seam lines first.